Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Super-Fanta-Fi. This being a show where we talk about TV shows of the supernatural, fantasy, and/or science fictional genre. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Evil. A lot of interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. I do like the fact is that it isn't like, like the miracle case they were working that kind of got brought up at the beginning of, at the end of last episode. It is kind of neat that we do just immediately kind of jump into that case. It's not like, that case was dealt with in between episodes, and then we own to, it's like, no, I like that the case is immediately kind of taken care of. I'm curious if the show going to keep that up. We'll see in the future. But regardless, basically the miracle case involves this girl named Naomi who basically died of cardiac arrest. Like she was playing soccer and then had a cardiac arrest episode and ended up dying. And basically she was dead for 3 hours. And, when she was, about to be examined by the medical examiner, a priest came in, said something, walks out. And then just as the medical examiner is slicing her face open, she wakes up, which is like, that's got to be the most horrendous thing. Because it's like she sits up, she's bleeding from her face and everything's like, that's a gnarly situation. Now, obviously, it's a very fascinating situation in many different regards because the head of the hospital, whatever, that dude is kind of trying to be basically she had a medical condition. I don't know medically the ins and outs of it, but basically it's there was, because of the compressions, at least that's what he says, that basically air got trapped in her lungs, making it impossible for her to breathe. So it looked like she had died when in fact she wasn't dead. What I really like though is because obviously, David's asking, about the condition and stuff like that because he's not aware. But then Kristen says something to dude's like, do you work for the church? And she's like, yep. She's got a big smile on her face. And David's got a smile on his face too because it caught the dude off guard because it's if we were here by ourselves, we wouldn't know what's up. But the fact is, Kristen's got medical experience, so she knows what questions to kind of bring up and ask. So I thought that was kind of a neat element of being this is, showing, that this is, a good union. Because obviously for him, it's we're not here to prove that this is a miracle. We just want to get to the truth as what this is all about. So as they look through surveillance tapes, because there's a lawsuit from Naomi's family looking into this situation, and Kristen knows the lawyer in particular, so she asks him for a favor and gets a copy of it. While they're watching, during, the trauma center, when they're trying to resuscitate her, there's an image that flows over the screen, and it looks like it's a ghost. It's like a white figure, and it's wait, what's up with that? Now, Ben being who he is, because like I said, Kristen seems like she kind of floats and be she's skeptical, but at the same time, it's whoa, what is that? Ben is adamant about trying to prove that. It's no, there's got to be something else. Maybe it's a glitch. Because obviously these are copies. It's we need to get the actual data itself. He even goes to the hospital and even asks the security guards, what's up with that? He's I don't know, it's spirit, ghost, whatever you want it to be. Because even Kristen was did I say something that kind of pissed him off? But David's no, it's just Ben doesn't like a mystery. He doesn't like things being I think when it's something that's kind of hard to explain, because he is the dude, I say, he's the skeptical one. It seems he is the one that probably typically ends up being no, this and that. Because even last episode, he found multiple rational reasons. He doesn't believe in all this. It's actually kind of interesting because we got a little dip into his life because we see him with his sister, and his sister's yo, so Dad said, are you going to join us for prayer? And Ben just kind of looks at her and she's Dad had to ask. So it seems he comes from a religious family. And so he's probably a little, maybe not necessarily a black sheep, but maybe borderline that. But it was kind of interesting. So they must have an idea what he does. Because it's so this is for that priest you work for. He's it's for my job. And she's yeah, with that priest you work for. It's what his sister was saying. So I think it is fascinating because like I said, Ben tried many different explanations. He's thinking hey, maybe it's because they were on the same date, maybe the data kind of got the video of, because it turns out that person whose image it was, because when the security guards recognized her, she was a patient named Bernadette who literally died an hour before Naomi did. And so the whole thing was okay, so that's her image. But, he was thinking maybe it was a superimposed image. But they asked even Naomi yo, what's up? Because even the EMT who was bringing her in was I honestly can't explain it. He's I don't know if it's necessarily a miracle, but that girl was dead and she came back to life, and that's what it is. What that actually is, I don't know. But they actually ask Naomi, what she remembers kind of looking at her coach and then like passing out, hitting the ground. Then she remembers this black swirling, essentially pit. And then 60 people came out of it, which is like referencing the 60 that Leland had made reference to. I think George had made reference to it too, but I'm pretty sure it was both Leland and George who had made reference to it. But so it's like, okay, so even under these circumstances, she's referencing the 60 and it's like, oh, they're coming for me. So maybe it's supposed to be represent like demons and creatures from, it might not even necessarily be a hell thing. It's just in the darkness of death, like if you're not, like maybe before you're able to draw to the light, maybe the darkness, that being these 60 demons are trying to drag you under. Maybe that's one way to look at it. But regardless, it's just interesting because we just had that conversation about the 60 last episode and now it's coming up again. It makes you think, yeah, there's definitely something to this potentially. I wonder, is it going to be kind of a similar thing to kind of like I know it's kind of like I made comparisons to like the Revenant in Winona Earp, kind of like the 13 Ghosts of Scooby-Doo type of thing of like, oh, there's these 13 ghosts that get released. Maybe it's kind of a similar thing. Maybe that's my thought, but regardless. So that's an interesting situation. But looking over the tapes, because even Ben, like I said, was kind of getting frustrated because he couldn't see the solution in all of this. It's actually David who figures it out. He actually looks into it and he figures out that this all kind of stems down to racism, that there is no miracle. That basically on average, the doctors, when it comes to like, in this particular hospital, when it comes to, performing like CPR, or like life-saving stuff like that, doctors on average in this particular case would work on a white patient for 58 minutes, but an African-American patient would get only 23 minutes. So for him, it's like, because he ends up explaining it later on, it's a combination of, yes, Naomi's condition, but also the reason why they didn't find it out is because they literally gave her 30 minutes less of attention than they would a white patient. So that's what this comes down to. So obviously they bring this information to that dude who's doing Naomi's civil suit. And so bringing this to his attention of like, yeah, they're, civil rights being denied in this particular case because you're obviously, denying someone equal service just because of their race. So I wonder, did he know that, the doctor? I mean, maybe it's something he had noticed, but he didn't care. Because he was quick to kind of try and throw the EMT under the bus about Naomi's situation because he was trying to avoid, medical loss, malpractice lawsuit and stuff like that. But obviously things are getting much worse. And, for him, obviously, because this is for the better, because it's like Naomi, her condition probably would have been fine if they had probably examined her more, given her more attention than they did, that they would have given any other patient, So there's that whole situation. So it's kind of interesting to also say like, hey, there was no miracle aspect to it. It's also interesting because we actually meet David's boss in this episode, which interestingly enough, that actor was also in Person of Interest. So it's like, which once again, it's just interesting to, all that, but, the Monsignor, it's actually kind of interesting because like we also see David's a bit of a like, as the Monsignor kind of puts it, he's a little bit of one who kind of takes jabs at he's kind of, because the fact of the matter is the Monsignor was like, okay, look into this miracle thing. At the end of the day, I want to know the truth because Father Augustus, he's the one that actually, people are worshiping, being like, oh my God, you're, the miracle priest. And it's like, at the end of the day, I want to know if this really was a miracle. It's not for you to disprove it or anything, just let me know the truth. But also he wants David to talk to Augustus because it's like he's a drunk. And it's like, because that's why he's having a hard time believing this, because it's like God would never use, a drunk, an alcoholic as means for his miracles to be pulled through. But then, David reminds him, it's like, oh, Moses, God did it through Moses, which I never knew. I'm not that well versed, in the Bible and stuff like that. So I didn't know that. Was that a thing? Was Moses a drunk or something like that? But the word I'm thinking of is contrarian. It's kind of what the Monsignor was kind of saying, that basically it's kind of like David kind of has to always go against the grain, essentially. But it was interesting when the case was solved. It's like, all right, well, case closed. Let's move on to this demon possession, which, David was like, yeah, but there's still this unexplained apparition thing of Bernadette. And it's kind of like, yeah, who cares? And it's like the Monsignor's just kind of like, yeah, that doesn't matter, leave it alone. And even David's like, wait, what? Like, you want me to look into possessions and miracles, yet there's something right here that we can't explain, and you're just pushing it off. Why? Maybe there's something greater here at play here. And the question is, like, I guess like certain things, it's kind of, I guess it's like certain things like that isn't to really be experienced. It's like proven, disproven, and I guess that's all it is. It's almost like some Grail level stuff of, like, you know, referencing Preacher. I know, like, a weird comparison to make, but how the Grail would wipe out anything that kind of went against, you know, it's like, oh, these miracles contradict this other, you know, the more traditional miracles and beliefs. So I'm wondering, is it kind of that where it's like, we're here to disprove these possessions to see if they're real or not. If they're real, we'll step in, save the day. If these miracles are real, maybe the point is, maybe the purpose really is to be like, no, this isn't a miracle. Anything outside of that realm is kind of like, don't touch it, because that's not something anyone else is really going to know about. So we don't need to bring too much attention to it. So maybe there's some, because even the Monsignor said it himself. It's like, talk to Augustus, because I don't want him to be an embarrassment to the church. So I think that's what this is all about. These cases David's investigating, it's more so about making the church seem more important, like giving it a better look of like, hey, like I said, we're here to, it's like, oh, this isn't possession. If it is possession, we're here to save the day. If it's a miracle, maybe try and swing it to be like the church was behind, like God was behind the miracle, bring people more so into, you know, the church and everything. That's what I'm curious about. That's me being very cynical about it, but that's just where my mind is. And I think that potentially could be an interesting storyline if they kind of go about the route where David's kind of like, it almost seems for him, it's like maybe the church has its own agenda. Like, he wants to do good. He wants to look into these things for the right reasons. But for him, maybe he feels like the church doesn't necessarily see things the right way. It's actually kind of interesting, because it seems like that kind of plays into a little bit about the Leland thing, because it turns out, because obviously Leland ends up taking Kristen's old job, and because Kristen was being offered to come back by her previous boss, Lewis, but obviously David wanted to keep Kristen around, so they were trying to, you know, he went to the Monsignor to try and get more money to kind of ensure, give her like a 2-year contract. That way she's able to, because she needs the money to look after her and her daughters, obviously. So there's that whole thing. But Leland took the job, and he's up there talking about the fact is he will kind of undo all that she's done, send the innocent to jail and free the guilty and stuff like that, just because it's like, oh, because you're so easy to kind of manipulate, essentially. And it's like, oh, that good old David of yours, like, ask him about the second time he ever saw God. It's an interesting story. And then he also starts referencing the fact is of like, oh yeah, like here's some other stuff from your sessions. So either he still has a copy of it, which he had told Lewis, like, oh, someone had hacked into his account or whatever. That's what this all stems from, which Kristen didn't believe him for a second, but it's just kind of like Lewis is willing to, because he thinks this is all her being jealous of like, oh, here's the new guy taking my position. And this already kind of sets it off to be like, man, Leland is going to be one of those sly kind of D-bags where it's like no one else is willing to see the evil that he is. But I guess that's kind of the perfect thing about evil. It can kind of potentially hide, you know, in plain sight. It just looks like, you know, they have a very good way of kind of disguising themselves. And obviously Kristen brings this up to David. And David straight up believes Leland to be a demon, that basically he hears, in layman's terms, it's just like he's here to destroy hope. He's even trying to cause a rift between Kristen and him. He's like trying to fill us with doubt and stuff like that, because he wants you to ask me about the second time I saw God. It is kind of interesting because, you know, because even Kristen was like, why would, you know, you telling me this story bring a rift between us? And David never did explain that particular time, but like obviously Kristen's not really pushing it, which Kristen didn't even talk to him about everything else she was dealing with in this episode, because it turns out her youngest daughter, which we learned the tragic situation behind that. Her youngest has this heart defect that's basically going to make it so that she has a 50-50 chance of she might die before she's 20. The fact is that she could just drop dead at any moment in the middle of anything, which obviously kind of almost reflects what went down with Naomi in this particular episode. Because obviously this plays into the whole reason why Kristen kind of has a hard time believing. Because for her, it's like, it's almost a flip of the coin that determines my little girl's fate, to the sense that, like, you know, what does prayer really do? Because plenty of people pray but still die because of cancer, of accidents, where terrible people kind of tend to live an okay life. They kind of still make it out okay in the end. And even David can't give it an answer. All he can do is like, oh, all I can do is pray for your daughter, which makes you wonder, is that why things kind of end up playing out the way they do later on? Is because like someone knows that he's praying for her, so just to kind of screw Kristen and him over to an extent, it's like, oh, you're doing this, I'm gonna push against the grain. If you're praying for her, I'm gonna throw a little evil and terror her way. Maybe because it turns out that Kristen and Laura had the same nightmare because she dreamed about the demon George and the whole, knife situation, cutting off the finger. She even brings it up to her therapist, Kurt, which that's an interesting scene because it shows you like, oh, the fact is she's telling Kurt, not to take notes anymore during their sessions because, obviously what happened last time. And obviously he's trying to make her feel better by being like, hey, there are more security measures in play here. So what happened before won't happen again. We should go back to week sessions. But obviously you obviously be a little reluctant to do that after what happened to your last sessions kind of being thrown and used against you like that. And once again, I'm sure Leland isn't done with it because he brings them up again, literally brings up even a different session than what she brought up. So there's that. And then on top of that, there's the whole situation of, it's interesting because Kurt, it's like, oh, he's actually kind of okay with like the fact is, I think if she's moved, because it's like, oh, this particular case had to do with demons, had to deal with miracles, which it seemed like, hey, he was kind of down for that because he sees like, maybe there's like a placebo effect with someone believing that something is a miracle and stuff like that from his experiences and stuff like that. So there's that. Turns out the whole George thing came from a movie, a horror movie that the girls were watching. And the moment, like, because Kristen is watching it with them, and the moment she sees the demon George in the movie, she pauses it and is like, wait, what? She's trying to keep her daughters from watching it because she ends up talking to Laura about like, okay, is that where this happened? Like, the thing is, like, because Kurt had even thrown it out there, it's like maybe Kristen and Laura had seen the same thing, and that's why it infiltrated her dreams like that. But it's like, I mean, the thing is, Kristen never really said, has she seen this movie before? Maybe she had. Had Laura seen this? Well, it wasn't even a movie; it was a TV show, apparently. So it's like, I also love the fact is it's like, I think that's kind of an interesting little side note conversation that was in the episode. It's like of that TV show, and Laura corrects her by being like, it was a streaming show, and she's like, streaming show, which I'm like, that's funny. I guess because now you have to make that distinction between, I mean, most people don't, I really don't, between TV and it's like, oh, this is a TV show, even if it's on a streaming site, which I think is funny. This is CBS, and CBS has its own streaming service, CBS All Access. Well, yeah, that's a streaming service. Yeah, regardless, I'm going in a whole tangent, but I just thought that was kind of interesting. And, Kristen had a nightmare about George, and even George, she's like, you're just something from a bad movie. And he's like, a bad movie. Now that's hurtful, threatening to hurt, Laura. But luckily Laura was up and she was able to wake Kristen up. And so to kind of conquer their fears, to let them know what makes up, before continuing to watch the movie, she showed all her kids and herself, obviously, a behind the scenes of kind of like, okay, the actor beneath the makeup and stuff like that, kind of bringing it up. And they're kind of, I actually kind of feel bad because like the actor has like a higher voice. He has this like, it's like when you compare it to like, oh, his demoness voice and stuff like that, and you hear his high voice, like the girls and even Kristen are laughing. But it is kind of like to conquer your fears, to realize like, oh, this is all George is. But the question is that the case, or is it more? Like, that's the thing, this trippy show of being like, everything seems like, no, there's a rational explanation. It's almost like some X-Files stuff of like, Fox has always been like, yeah, there's something crazy going on, where Mulder's like, or is it, yeah. I said Mulder. That's Fox Mulder. Regardless, Mulder's all about the whole like, yeah, there's some crazy stuff going down. Scully, it's like, you're crazy, Mulder. You're what? Even when the stuff is right there in front of her, which Kristen isn't as like in denial as like Scully was in many different cases, but still, it seems like it borderlines on kind of like having that kind of bit of a, David kind of being the Molar of the group, but being probably a little more open, because I feel like Mulder could be a little more rigid maybe, and Scully's kind of a little more rigid, whereas Kristen's more, she's rigid, but she's a lot more kind of, I don't know, regardless of the whole situation. What was also interesting too, because David had mentioned the fact, obviously the conversation had come up of like, I've never had visions like you, which David talks about the fact that he had visions, but it was around the time he was dealing with the loss of a friend, and that was Julia, but he's like, he hasn't had any visions since. And in the grand scheme of things, because at first he was running by a club, and then obviously later on the demon, potential demon Leland was kind of in his mind messing with him, being like, hey, the fact of the matter is, it's like bringing up sex and him thinking about Kristen. And it's like, all the fact of the matter is, isn't it interesting that when it comes to like, sex and stuff like that, and someone screaming out in pleasure, it's like, oh, it's never, oh, that she was a saint. It's always she was a demon. So there's that whole thing. But at first I thought the whole club thing was like, oh, he was running by the club, and I was like, oh, it's a sex thing. I was like, and then I start thinking like, oh, and then he goes by later and he's reluctant. I was like, oh, was your thing drugs or something? I was like, were you a partier or something like that? And then he goes to a guy, and the guy looks like he knows, and I'm like, yep, you've been here before. He even asked about Julia, so I'm like, okay. So the pieces are starting to come together. The visions he had, the reason why he doesn't talk about it is like, yeah, the visions he had probably set him down the path of like, oh, I'm opening his mind up more. But then he probably like, what? It might be a thing of like, because he's referencing, oh, the second time he's seen God, it might have been a situation where he overdosed and almost died, and that probably potentially changed everything for him. That was probably it, where it's like when he was dealing with everything that happened to Julia, it's probably like that probably what happened to her. She probably overdosed in that regard, and someone who's trying to lead their complicated past behind, and that's probably why he doesn't want Kristen to know, because if she knew about like his addictions and stuff like that, it's like, oh, he might think like she'll look at me differently. It's like she'll doubt my work effort, and it's like, oh, I'm working, because in his mind he's probably thinking she'll think she's working with a junkie. That's what I think might be like the justification he might be thinking. But I just thought that was so interesting that like, because everyone has their demons and their vices to kind of compensate for stuff. Like, we don't know what in David's path sent him down that path. Did him and Julia meet up, and were they both already dealing with that? Did it come up? Did like it start with his addiction, and did it pass on to her because he drew her in? Was he already dealing with it, and Julia wasn't, but then he brought, like, I'm curious, is that why he kind of feels guilt? Because maybe he brought her into that world. I don't know, or maybe she could have, vice versa, she could have brought him into it. I'm very interested to kind of dive into that, especially because that's such an interesting thing, an interesting secret to kind of keep, and especially because he kind of dabbles down that lane at the end of this episode. It's like, well, what does that mean going forward? Is things going to kind of spiral more and more, or is he going to end up, because he's going to try and put up a good front, but there might start being cracks where Kristen notices something's up. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see where ultimately all this ends up taking us into the next episode. This is taking some interesting turns. I wasn't really expecting that with David's story, but I think that's kind of neat, and it kind of explains a lot about like what Leland's kind of referencing, and it adds context to some stuff that David has been pretty vague about. So hopefully, on the next episode, which this next episode is also potentially going, like I said, if they're continuing the thing of like, oh, this case they reference at the end of the episode, this demon possession might legitimately be the next case that they work on in the next episode. The parallels between them working on that plus David literally dealing with his own demons. I'd be interested to kind of see them potentially elaborate more on all of David's, situation. So, but really, that's all I want to talk about. To the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.